Imagine standing in a palace where the walls are lined not with wallpaper but with slabs of gold, where servants pour wine from silver urns while armies wait at the gates, ready to defend their master's fortune. These weren't billionaires in skyscrapers or tech titans in Silicon Valley. These were families who ruled entire civilizations, their riches so immense they could build monuments to eternity and still have treasure left to fund armies, voyages, and dynasties. But here's the part most of us never think about. In the ancient world, wealth wasn't just counted in coins. It was measured in land, in harvests that could feed nations, in control of rivers and trade routes that were lifelines for entire peoples. It was wealth that didn't just buy luxury, it built empires. And yet, as we peel back the layers of history, one question rises. Were these riches a blessing or a curse? Because every empire built on unimaginable wealth carried within it the seeds of its own downfall. The story begins with the raw engines of ancient prosperity, how power, gold, and grain fused into dynasties that would shape the world. When we think of wealth today, we picture stock portfolios, billion-dollar tech valuations, or private islands. But in the ancient world, wealth was something far more primal and far more visible. It wasn't about digits on a screen. It was about who could command the river that fed the fields, who could tax the caravans trudging across desert routes, who could decide whether an army marched or starved. Gold glittered, yes, but it was often the least important part of fortune. Real power lay in the silent riches, grain stored in vast granaries that could outlast drought, fertile land that stretched beyond the horizon, or fleets of ships loaded with spices, silk, and precious stones. One family controlling these lifelines could bend entire nations to their will. Think about it. In a world where one bad harvest meant collapse, a single dynasty with control over food supplies could play God, deciding who lived, who died, and who bowed. Wealth wasn't just luxury, it was leverage. It was the invisible rope that tied empires together. And yet that rope could just as easily become a noose. Because with every storehouse of grain, with every overflowing treasury, came something dangerous: envy. Rivals watched, allies turned, and history shows us again and again that fortunes large enough to build monuments were also big enough to paint a target on their owners' backs. The blueprint for empire was always the same. Agriculture fed armies, trade fattened coffers, and conquest brought in spoils. But every time there was one family or one bloodline that stood at the center, absorbing the riches of millions. These were the first billionaire dynasties, and no dynasty understood this better than the Pharaohs of Egypt. Families who didn't just amass wealth, but turned it into something eternal, carving their fortunes into stone so massive they still defy time itself. If there was ever a family that perfected the art of turning wealth into godlike power, it was the Pharaohs of Egypt. They didn't just rule a kingdom, they ruled the very rhythm of life itself. Their greatest asset wasn't gold or gems, but a river, the Nile. Every year, the Nile would flood, spilling rich black silt across the fields. To most, it was a miracle of nature. To the pharaohs, it was an inexhaustible vault of wealth. Whoever controlled the river controlled Egypt's breadbasket, and by extension, its destiny. Grain became currency, feeding not just farmers and merchants, but also armies and temple priests. A good harvest made the pharaoh divine in the eyes of his people. A bad one, even gods could fall from grace. But the pharaohs were more than managers of food. They were architects of awe. With their wealth, they built monuments so vast they seemed impossible. Pyramids that pierced the sky, temples that swallowed entire city blocks. These weren't just tombs or shrines, they were stone propaganda. Each block screamed a message. This ruler is eternal, this dynasty is unshakable. Behind the gilded masks and towering obelisks lay an economic machine. Taxes flowed in from farmers, traders, and craftsmen. Spoils of conquest piled up in storerooms. Foreign rulers sent tribute just to stay in Egypt's good graces. Wealth was the backbone of both faith and fear, binding the pharaoh to the gods and the people in one unbroken chain. And yet, the greater their fortune, the greater the peril. Envious nobles, ambitious generals, and even foreign invaders saw Egypt's riches as irresistible prizes. Time and again, the land of the Nile was both nourished and cursed by the weight of its own abundance. But Egypt was not alone. Across the Mediterranean, another empire discovered that wealth didn't always come from rivers or grain. It could be conjured out of numbers, deals, and influence. And in Rome, the richest families weren't farmers or kings, they were financiers. When we picture Rome, we often think of emperors draped in purple, gladiators in the arena, or legions marching in perfect formation. But beneath the marble arches and political speeches, there was another power at work, families who didn't wield swords but numbers. These were Rome's financial dynasties, the silent billionaires of the ancient world. Rome was an empire built on conquest, but conquest needed funding. And that's where the publicani, wealthy equestrian families, stepped in. They financed armies, collected taxes from conquered provinces, and ran businesses so sprawling they made modern corporations look modest. Picture this. A single Roman family might control mining in Spain, shipping in the Mediterranean, and tax collection in Asia Minor all at once. Gold wasn't just stored in vaults, it was put to work. These families pioneered early versions of banking, lending to senators, even to generals, at interest rates that could make or break careers. A victorious general might return to Rome hailed as a hero, but behind the scenes it was often the financiers who had staked his campaign. If he won, they got richer. If he lost, they still collected in land or influence. The wealthiest Roman households lived in opulence. Villas with heated floors, libraries filled with Greek philosophy, banquets that stretched for days. But their true luxury was leverage. They could sway elections, bankroll coups, and even dictate laws to protect their fortunes. Senators might thunder in the forum, but many owed debts that chained them quietly to Rome's moneyed class. And yet this power carried risk. Rome's emperors were wary of families too rich to control. Fortunes were confiscated overnight, political rivals were exiled, and some of the greatest houses of Rome were erased because their wealth threatened the throne itself. It was a dangerous game. Too little money and you were powerless, too much and you were marked. But while Rome's dynasties mastered the art of invisible finance, another empire on the far side of the world discovered a different path to power, one built not on credit or contracts, but on absolute control. That empire was Qin China, and its riches came from unifying an entire civilization under a single ruler. In the 3rd century BCE, a storm was gathering in the east. While Rome was still a republic of squabbling senators, China was being welded into one vast empire under a single iron will, the Qin dynasty. And with unification came something the ancient world had rarely seen before: wealth on a scale that was not just enormous, but centralized. The Qin emperor, Qin Shi Huang, understood something that even Rome's financiers hadn't mastered. Money was power, but only if it flowed the same way everywhere. So he did something radical. He standardized coins, weights, and measures. A merchant in the north and a farmer in the south now used the same currency, the same scales, the same laws. Suddenly, trade and taxation became efficient machines, funneling wealth straight into the imperial treasury. But the Qin didn't stop at currency. They invested in infrastructure on a colossal scale. Roads stitched the empire together, canals moved grain to where it was needed most, and fortifications, the first stages of what we now call the Great Wall, rose to secure the frontiers. Every brick, every roadstone, every coin was a reminder. This was a dynasty that didn't just hoard riches, it multiplied them through control. And then there was the emperor's own fortune. Qin Shi Huang poured unimaginable sums into projects that blurred the line between vanity and vision. His tomb, still sealed today, was said to be a miniature empire underground, with rivers of mercury and an army of terracotta soldiers to guard him for eternity. It wasn't just wealth displayed, it was wealth weaponized, designed to project power even beyond death. But centralized riches came with a hidden cost. The people who built the roads, walls, and palaces often did so under brutal conditions, their labor feeding the empire's glory. Resentment grew, and after Qin Shi Huang's death, the dynasty collapsed within a generation. The riches that had unified China also sowed the seeds of rebellion. And yet, even as empires crumbled, one truth endured. The legacy of their fortunes outlasted their rulers. What mattered wasn't just the gold or the monuments, but the systems of wealth they left behind, systems that still echo in our world today. The pyramids still stand, the Roman roads still lie beneath modern highways, the Great Wall still carves its path across mountains. These aren't just ruins, they are the fingerprints of wealth turned into power and power turned into permanence. What's striking is not just the scale of these ancient fortunes, but the way they redefined what wealth could mean. For the pharaohs, riches meant the ability to merge politics with divinity so that faith itself became a treasury. For Rome's elite, it was financial ingenuity, turning influence into invisible empires of debt and credit. For the Qin, it was centralized control, proving that wealth wasn't just about possessions, but about systems. Their stories remind us that fortune is never neutral. In one hand it builds, in the other it destroys. The same grain that fed Egypt could also spark revolts when harvests failed. The same financial networks that empowered Rome's families made them targets for emperors. The same standardization that unified China made it brittle when rebellion struck. And yet the legacies of these dynasties didn't vanish with their collapse. They lingered, shaping the future. Egypt's monumental building inspired millennia of architecture. Rome's financial innovations foreshadowed modern banking. China's centralized systems became the foundation for the dynasties that followed. So the question lingers, are today's billionaires really so different? When tech magnates build rockets or carve their names into towers, when financial dynasties fund politics from behind the curtain, when governments tighten their grip on infrastructure and trade, are we simply watching history repeat itself under a new mask? And if history teaches us anything, it's this: fortunes may fade, families may fall, but the echo of empire builders never truly dies. Which brings us to the final question: what in the end is the true legacy of wealth?